So I think this is an interesting comment. It was on one of my videos, and I wanted to talk about it because it's very different from the way that I think about stuff. And so I thought it would be fun to look at somebody who thinks very differently than me, and I want to take it honestly and assume that he's coming with best intentions, despite the fact that he called me one of these guys and made it sound weird that I got the shot and wore a mask during the thing that happened from 2019 to like kind of still now a little bit, but really like 2023. So let's start with that actually, the C-19. So obviously saying that masking and vaxing is bad is an anti-intellectual, anti-establishment sort of thing, right? You maybe believe that it was all a hoax or it just wasn't as bad as that and people were going to die. Obviously that wasn't true, but this comes from living in an anti-establishment echo chamber and an anti-intellectual echo chamber. I can't blame him for that. We're all siloed into our own echo chambers at this point. But let's be clear, neither president's response to C-19 was great. Now, honestly, I would say Trump's initial response was better than Biden's response. He's the one who closed the borders and decided initially to follow the science with Dr. Fauci, and his was Operation Lightspeed, which got us the first round of the COVID vaccine. He was also the one who started the lockdown and sent us the stimulus checks. All good things, right? But the deeper we got in, the more anti-science and conspiratorial he got. He's also the same guy who wondered if we could inject bleach in ourselves or use horse dewormer. He started using racist tropes about the Chinese and actively spreading anti-science conspiracies online. And in the end, he's the reason why we had refrigerators full of victims in many red states around the country. People who didn't need to be victims became them because of Donald Trump. Now, for Biden, I don't have a lot of good to say about his response, honestly, outside of his early actions, which were just to continue to follow the science and keep lockdown going as rates of infection went down and getting more people the vaccine. All that stuff was super great, right? But then he stopped and he declared the thing over long before it actually was, because at some point, and this is super gross, he made the calculation that saving the economy was more important than the lives it cost to save that economy. And when push truly comes to shove, neoliberals value our labor more than our lives. And that's a bummer. So next he mentions Biden, and I'm going to assume he means the Biden era economy. And the one thing I want to give Biden credit for is he had to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, both because of the C-19 and because of some of Trump's policies, right? So for Trump, though, if we just ignore all the C-19 data, because that was a spike, it's not like he had control over any of that stuff, right? The value of goods and services dropped. The GDP growth rate slowed. Wages grew more slowly, but the poverty rate was down. However, he ballooned the national debt by 46%, the largest of any president in history, started a steel tariff war that cost the United States 75,000 steelworking jobs in the United States. He lowered the top cap on the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, which boosted consumer spending, which is great, but it also continued to make billionaires richer while wages continued to stagnate against inflation, which is why even by the end of Biden's term, nobody felt better about how much money they were making, right? Of course, some of this is still based on external factors, but Trump inflicted multiple wounds on the economies, especially on working class people, while putting up big giveaways to millionaires and billionaires. Now, Biden failed to turn back those tax cuts, which were actively harmful, and is the reason why the four richest people in the world are richer than they've ever been. And it's what made a lot of people real mad about the economic policy, right? Biden choosing to run it again, and the cost of groceries is basically what cost the Democrats the election and allowed Trump to win. Biden was a bad candidate. The economy wasn't feeling good for people, right? But so on an economic level, though, like, the U.S. had the best economic recovery post C-19 in the world, but it didn't serve the working people. Sure, we had the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. 12.6% GDP growth is huge. 16.6 million new jobs created is great, right? But economies are both vibes and data based. And if you both feel like, and you are paying more for basic things without making significantly more money, it's always the president who gets the blame, right or wrong. And kind of right in his case, because he didn't actually do anything to fix the wage problem. That being said, his work around prescription drugs and targeted debt forgiveness and bank regulations were objectively good for both people and for the economy. Now, unbiased, non-American, out there just looking at stuff economists who generally care less about people will tell you that Trump inherited an incredibly strong economy. But for us, it didn't feel strong at all. Next, he mentions waste, fraud, and abuse, which is a fun GOP talking point that comes from wanting to cut social programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, because the goal of conservative ideology is to ensure that the people at top make more money and then rely on the failed trickle-down economics to hope that they'll be nice to poor people, I guess. Obviously, that's not what happened. But here's the deal. Every large organization has waste, fraud, and abuse, but there's nothing about the Biden administration that made it uniquely wasteful, fraudulent, or abusive. The Steelman argument for his position is that the federal government should not be using our money for things we don't want them to in terms of research and social engineering and economic policy. And it's a fair proposition, right? It's a common talking point. And there's a lot of people who believe that. I just happen to not be one of them. We live in the richest country in the world. We have the opportunity to build a country that works for everyone here and not just for the billionaires. Medicare for all would actually be cheaper and more efficient than our current healthcare system. And Social Security is the most monetarily and bureaucratically efficient program in American history. Now, that's not to say things couldn't be run better, because they always can be. But laying off hundreds of thousands of people under the will of programmers who are under the drinking age without thoughtfully considering what that would do to the services for people who rely on them has actively led to the unaliving of thousands of people and will lead to more. Not to mention the impact on the lives of those who lost their jobs and their families because a billionaire and his minions are interested in making the richest man in the world feel important and become even richer without meaningfully fixing anything. He mentions kerfuffle, and I'm going to assume he's talking about the Ukraine-Russia kerfuffle, and that we've paid them money, and that seems unfair. And he probably believes that, the President Zelensky has stolen a bunch of things which were proven untrue, and that he might actually be the dictator, even though he's just following the Constitution. They're not allowed to have elections in wartime. But that's true. We have given them money and arms because we signed a treaty to protect them after they gave away the nuclear weapons that were inside their borders when the USSR fell apart, right? It's also a moral good to protect people who are in need when you have the means and opportunity to do so. Ukraine was invaded. They are a democracy, and they're not a perfect one, but no democracy is. They were following the rules of their constitution. Russia violated 200 separate agreements with them prior to the invasion, and they are fighting for their political sovereignty. Russia is the aggressor, an oligarchic, hypo-neoliberal petrostate with zero regard for the lives of their soldiers or civilians or Ukrainian soldiers or civilians. Few situations are more cut and dry for a Western liberal democracy, which is what we are, than to go help another member of our community. Our fundamental failing was believing Putin would hold to his red lines and not arming Ukraine to the teeth when we had the chance, which is purely Biden's fault, by the way. Now, if you're talking about the kerfuffle in the Middle East, October 10th was a horrible day, and the people who did it should be punished to the nines, right? But the tens and thousands of women and children and men who are innocent who have died since is equally, if not more so, horrible. And Trump has been perfectly happy to pump money into that, despite it being an act of colonial conquest. So is it that you dislike war, or that you just dislike the one you're told to dislike? Last but not least, he mentions, equaling trade situation, right? This belies a vast misunderstanding of how trade works, and trust me, my degree is in international relations, and the grade I'm most proud of is the B+ I got in international economic relations, hardest class I ever took. Here's the deal. Trade surpluses and deficits are neither good nor bad, nor should they be judged as like a whole number. There's not like a U.S. to China trade deficit, right? There's like a chips deficit, or a lumber deficit, or a corn deficit, right? So tariffs are a useful tool, but not to equalize trade. In fact, by the end of Trump's first term, our trade deficits were higher than any time in the last decade, specifically because of our trade war with China. The most important lesson you ever learn about international trade is that bilateral trade is essentially a meaningless term, right? So you mad at Canada about some trade deficit or China about some trade deficit. Doesn't matter. What matters is the company's the country's capital account and where investments are going. Right. So what trade deficits tell you is that investment is flowing back and forth between the two countries and jobs are being created, right? So if that capital account between the two countries shifts, you're no longer getting investment because of the tariffs that you put on. That's why they're called a tax on the country that made the tariffs and not the country that didn't, because that country can make the choice to take its money elsewhere and you can't, right? Now, if your goal is solely to increase the manufacture of American goods and bring manufacturing back into the United States, I have two pieces of bad news for you. The first is that our wages are too high to compete with small manufacturing countries around the world. And the second is that we live in an integrated global economy. It just doesn't work because rare earth minerals, right? Like we just don't have the rare earth minerals to make all the stuff here, which interestingly is why the US is eyeing Greenland and Canada and to a lesser extent Panama so hard, which, by the way, would also be wars. So here's what I'm saying. It's okay to have different beliefs. It's okay to have different political goals in mind, and I will happily politically disagree with anyone any day of the week. But we have to live in the same fact-based world. That's all I care about in my life. And I just thought this was fascinating because we came from two different worlds. Now, here's your call to action, because you always got to have a call to action. 3 big elections coming up on Tuesday. You know, Josh Weil, Gay Vallimont, and Susan Crawford, Supreme Court in Wisconsin. If you've got a minute, sign up for one of those 2-hour virtual phone banks and help out for just a second. Those 2 Florida races are way closer than they should be, which is why Elise Stefanik is back in the House and not going to be our UN representative. So get out there, do the good work. And this, I'm not going to censor you, my brother. I promise I don't believe in censorship. If you want to call me one of these guys on my comments, I'm happy for the interaction. Cool? Cool. Oh my God, I blanked on her name in Wisconsin. Susan, well, blah, blah, blah.